Today's video is a further discussion about what is required to be disclosed to a buyer by a seller in a residential buy-sale transaction. In the video presented on March 31, 2016, I discussed the difference between the statutory seller's disclosure notice and the common law disclosure requirements. Common law requirements can only be discerned through a study of case law, i.e., what have the courts determined should be disclosed to the buyer. The courts look at whether there was damage to the buyer for failure to disclose and whether seller failed to disclose with the intent that the buyer acted in a certain way. That is, complete the close. Because the courts get to decide the issue, my best advice to any seller is to over-disclose and not under-disclose. I get this question repeatedly. Does a suicide or murder that happens on a property have to be disclosed? The law requires disclosure of a death occurring on the property which resulted from the condition of the property. Arguably, suicide or murder does not fall into this category. However, some may argue that the property now has a stigma attached to it and that failure to disclose causes the buyer damage, and under case law, it should be disclosed. There are some that go so far as to state that perhaps it was the condition of the property that caused the suicide or murder. My advice is always to encourage the seller to disclose whether they are absolutely required by law or not. Because bottom line, even if seller doesn't disclose it, there is a high likelihood that the buyer will find out about the death anyway. For those of you who grew up watching Bewitched, you remember the nosy neighbor, Mrs. Kravitz? The one who loved to tell anyone who would listen all the scoop. If you are in the middle of your transaction and the buyer finds out through someone other than the seller that a death occurred on the property, the buyer will lose whatever trust he or she may have had in the seller. Once the parties lose trust, it is much harder to get the transaction across the finish line, irrespective of what other legal issues may arise. Following the same line of thinking, what other disclosures may be questionable? An agent asked me, does the seller have to disclose information he received from an anonymous sender that stated the sender was aware toxic chemicals existed on the property? My answer to that question was it depends. If in fact there are no toxic chemicals on the property, then the answer is no. However, if there is, then the answer is yes. In this situation, I recommend the seller have an environmental assessment inspection made on the property to confirm no toxins. Otherwise, the seller has to disclose the letter and its contents. It is difficult to believe that the law would require this disclosure when someone sends an anonymous letter. But the fact is that the letter was anonymous would be a defense in favor of the seller, but it may not be enough to avoid liability. Besides legal liability, what makes you think that the sender who sent an anonymous letter to the seller won't also send it to the buyer when they find out who the buyer is? Once again, the buyer loses trust. My advice is always to over-disclose and not under-disclose. This video is brought as a service to you from Allegiance Title Company. We hope in turn that we can service you at the closing table. Thank you.